I shook myself out of the haze that had consumed me, my thoughts gradually sharpening after wandering aimlessly for what felt like ages. The dim light in the workshop didn't help. It muted everything, making the objects around me seem lifeless, pushed into the background. One of my squash rackets sat clamped in the vise on my workbench, a stark reminder of what I'd been doing before my mind drifted into that void. For who knows how long, I'd been lost in the kind of thoughtlessness where the world fades away, where you don't see or hear a thing around you. It was the faint sound of music that pulled me back, the familiar tune of Lady and the Tramp drifting in from upstairs. I figured it was coming from the playroom. Emily and Chloe were probably watching it again, maybe for the 1,000th time. It used to be a family favorite, but at some point, Claire and I had started finding excuses to avoid it. Too many memories, I guess. I stretched in the chair, glancing at the clock on the wall. I'd been sitting there for over 30 minutes, barely moving, my brow furrowed as I struggled to process the nagging feeling that had settled in my chest since lunch. Claire was still upstairs, tidying up the kitchen, while I had come down here to work on my squash rackets. Squash had become an outlet for me over the last 8 years, a way to stay active, escape the monotony of daily life, and achieve something tangible. I climbed my way up to the top local league and even placed in a few tournaments. It felt good to have something like that, something that was just mine. Emily must have heard the cartoon and gone to watch it. Chloe, as always, had followed her big sister into the playroom. Chloe adored Emily, wanted to be wherever she was. At 4 years old, she idolized her 7-year-old sister, and, thankfully, Emily didn't seem to mind yet. But as I sat there, a wave of sadness swept over me. One day, Emily would grow older, start pulling away, needing her space. It's inevitable. I've seen it happen with siblings before, but it doesn't make it any easier to think about. Ryan, my 9-year-old, was in his room as usual, playing with model planes and cars. He had my family's features, the chestnut hair, almond-shaped eyes, and a strong jawline. Emily, on the other hand, was her mother's twin, with fiery red hair and soft, delicate features. Then there was Chloe, with her blonde curls that seemed to be a mix of both of us. I loved each of my kids fiercely, though I'll admit my relationship with each of them was different. I had just finished working on the handles of 3 rackets when I noticed that a couple of strings needed tightening. Great, I thought. If there's one thing I know, it's that a string always breaks when you least want it to, probably during my next match. With a sigh, I stepped out of the workshop to check on the girls. In the playroom, Emily and Chloe sat on the floor, engrossed in the movie, surrounded by a sea of scattered toys. The cheerful voices and melodies from the old VCR filled the room, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I decided to head upstairs. As I climbed the basement stairs, the creak of each step echoed in the quiet house. That's when I heard Claire's voice. She was on the phone, and I could tell from her tone that it was one of her animated conversations. My mind drifted back to that morning when we had shared a rare moment of tenderness by the fireplace. It had stirred something in me, a romantic feeling I hadn't felt in a while. I had thought about surprising her later, maybe with candles and rose petals like I used to. We'd managed to keep the intimacy alive over the years, even after 3 kids and a decade of marriage. As I reached the kitchen door, I stopped. Through the small opening, I could see Claire standing there, her back to me. She looked beautiful, her red curls falling over her bare shoulders. She wore a light summer dress that clung to her in all the right ways. For a moment, I just watched her, appreciating her. Then I heard her speak again. Tuesday through Thursday, 9 to 3, she said, her tone casual. There was a pause. Yes, I could talk. Ethan's in the basement with the girls right now. I lingered in the hallway, unsure why I didn't just walk in. Something about her tone made me stop. Then it changed. Her voice grew softer, almost secretive. Why, yes, I think so too, Lisa. I've been thinking about it a lot lately. Next weekend. Well, we don't have anything planned. I suppose I could make it work. Lisa Parker, Claire's friend and co-worker. They'd been close for years, and while I never thought much of their friendship, something about this conversation felt off. Then Claire laughed, a sound so unguarded, so full of joy, it took me back to our honeymoon. I hadn't heard her laugh like that in years. Her voice dropped even further, into a tone that made my stomach twist. Of course, I'd love to try that again. Before work gets in the way. My breath caught in my chest. What did she mean? My mind scrambled for an explanation, but nothing seemed to fit. Before I could stop myself, I took a step back into the shadows. Her laughter continued, and I strained to hear the words that followed. Last time it worked for me. I know. Tell them both I'm ready to meet. Oh, I can't wait. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and quietly descended back to the basement, my heart pounding in my ears. Collapsing into the old armchair, I felt my head spinning. Her words replayed in my mind like a broken record, stabbing at me with every repetition. It was as if the voice I had known and loved for years suddenly belonged to a stranger. Could it really be what it sounded like? Was Claire, my Claire, hiding something from me? And if so, what? How deep did it go? The memory of that night at the bar with my teammates flooded back. The night I had overheard something that I had desperately tried to forget. Could it all be connected? My palms were sweating, my throat dry, and all I could do was sit there, replaying everything in my head, hoping, praying for some kind of explanation that would make this all go away. But deep down, I feared the truth was something I wasn't ready to face. The festive lights reflected in her eyes, and I remember thinking how captivating Debbie could be. She was sharp, beautiful, and always the life of the party, commanding attention effortlessly. Her husband, Daniel, was the opposite, always reserved, rarely smiling, as if something heavy sat on his shoulders at all times. I didn't know them all that well, just a few interactions here and there, but something about Daniel always struck me as distant, like he wasn't fully present. John and Steve, my squash partners, had joined the league about 2 years ago. John was doing well with his booming construction business, and Steve, a managing partner at a residential construction company, seemed content with his steady career. They weren't just partners on the court, but friends I could count on. At least I thought so back then. Most of our interactions revolved around squash and brief conversations after games, but we bonded over shared experiences, being married, juggling careers, raising kids. Looking back, I realized those commonalities masked deeper divides I was only starting to uncover. One evening, during a casual conversation, I mentioned where Claire worked. That's when John perked up, saying he knew someone there. Lisa Parker, Claire's close friend and co-worker. John said Lisa had gone to the same high school as him and Steve, and they occasionally crossed paths, reminiscing about their school days. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now it feels like a piece of some bigger, darker puzzle I'm struggling to put together. The shopping trip started about 2 years ago, not long after Chloe turned 2. Claire had been overwhelmed, juggling a demanding part-time job, running the household, and caring for 3 kids. Chloe was still a baby, and Emily had just started preschool, attending only half-days. Claire was exhausted, and, to be fair, I wasn't around much to help. I'd been consumed by a major project at work, staying late most evenings. One night, Claire broke down. She collapsed onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. I'll never forget the shock of seeing her like that. I rushed to her, wrapped my arms around her, and tried to comfort her as best as I could. When she finally calmed down, she admitted how much she needed a break. Guilt hit me like a brick. I hadn't realized how bad it had gotten. I promised her I'd take care of the kids on her next day off, so she could do whatever she needed to recharge. She looked at me with tearful gratitude and said she'd think about it. A couple of weeks later, Claire mentioned she had talked to Lisa about needing a day off. Lisa had suggested a shopping trip to Detroit. Despite my initial hesitation, I agreed. I figured Claire deserved a break, and I trusted her. That Saturday, she and Lisa left early in the morning. They had breakfast at some cozy cafe and spent the day browsing boutiques and stores. She called me from the motel they checked into, giving me all the details. When she came home the next evening, she was beaming. She hugged and kissed me, gushing about how relaxing the trip had been. She hadn't spent much money, just bought a few small things for herself and the kids. I was happy for her, and the kids had behaved well, so I didn't have any complaints. That was over 2 years ago. Since then, these shopping trips have become a regular thing. Every 3 to 4 months, Claire and Lisa would head out early on a Saturday and return late Sunday evening. I never minded. I enjoyed having the extra time with the girls, and Claire always seemed so grateful afterward. But there was one trip about a year ago that stuck with me. When Claire came home, she seemed different, gloomy, almost nervous. I asked her about it, and she brushed it off, saying it was just PMS. I tried to believe her, but something felt off. That night, she didn't come to bed the way she usually did after these trips. We always made love before she left, and again when she returned. It was our unspoken tradition. But not that night. Since then, I've noticed a shift. Claire's excitement before these trips has become almost too much. The week before she leaves, her energy is electric, her enthusiasm palpable. I wanted to believe it was just the thrill of getting a break from the daily grind, but the doubts have been creeping in, whispering to me when I'm alone. "Phil, it's time for the girls to go upstairs for their bath. Can you send them up?" Claire's voice called out from the top of the stairs, pulling me out of my thoughts. I sat there, gathering myself. "Phil, can you hear me?" She called again, her tone sharper this time. "I hear you," I replied, standing up and heading toward the stairs. "Girls, time to head up for your bath," I said, pretending to sound like the stern dad. Emily and Chloe groaned, but obediently shuffled upstairs. Afterward, I wandered aimlessly around the house, trying to find something, anything, to occupy my mind. Eventually, I went upstairs to the kitchen, where Claire was flipping through a cookbook. She looked up, smiled warmly, and asked, "Is something wrong, dear? You seem a bit flustered." Caught off guard, I mumbled something about finding a crack in one of my squash rackets. But as I looked into her eyes, I couldn't stop myself from searching for something deeper, some hidden sign that would confirm or dismiss my growing suspicions. Claire laughed lightly and kissed me on the cheek. "Lisa called while you were downstairs. She wanted to know if we could go shopping next weekend," she said, glancing at me quickly. Too quickly. That fleeting, evaluating look made my stomach churn. "Don't we have something planned for next weekend?" I asked, scrambling for an excuse. "Isn't there an event at the Veterans Legion Saturday night? We could go to that." Claire gave me a look, her patience clearly thinning. "You know I don't enjoy those gatherings, Phil. All you guys do is talk about the war and drink too much. It's boring for me. If you want to go, just get a babysitter while I'm gone." I fumbled for another suggestion. "Why don't we do something with the kids instead? Cedar Point is still open. Chloe's old enough to enjoy it now." Her face darkened, a rare flush of anger rising to her cheeks. "What's wrong with you, Phil? You've never had a problem with my shopping trips before," she snapped. "Nothing," I said quietly. "I just thought we could spend some time together. But if you and Lisa have plans, it's fine. I'll take care of the kids." I turned and walked toward the stairs, avoiding her gaze. Halfway up, I glanced back and saw her standing there, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite place. That night, I went to bed early, hoping to escape my swirling thoughts. Claire came in later, changed into her pajamas, and slid into bed beside me. "Phil," she whispered, nudging me softly. I pretended to be asleep, keeping my breathing slow and even. After a moment, she sighed and turned away. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling. Memories of the past replayed in my mind. Claire's laughter, her tears, her warm embrace. But now, all I could think about were the cracks forming beneath the surface of our life together, threatening to split everything apart. For months after being sent to a remote base deep in the Vietnamese jungle, I was carried out on a stretcher, barely holding on to life. My best friend Jace? He left in a body bag. The grief swallowed me whole. Weeks in the hospital and months in rehabilitation blurred into a haze. But the wounds weren't just physical. The Army insisted I see a psychiatrist, and while I sat in that cold, sterile office, I realized the war hadn't just taken Jace. It had taken a part of me too. When I was almost cleared to return to duty, they transferred me to Fort Sill as an instructor's assistant. I kept to myself, avoiding other soldiers. I spent most of my free time enrolled in college courses and drowning in assignments. Anything to keep my mind busy. A year later, I requested an early discharge to continue my education. Surprisingly, the Army granted it, and I was sent home 5 months early. Back at my parents' house, I slipped into a routine of survival, not living. Veteran benefits and odd jobs kept me afloat, My expenses were minimal, but my existence felt hollow. I was the stereotypical Vietnam vet, traumatized and misunderstood. I let my hair grow long and my beard thicker, blending into my tattered jeans, worn sneakers, and old army jacket. I avoided people. The public's disdain for the war, combined with my own memories, turned me into a recluse. My family worried about me, but I didn't know how to let them in. Once a month, I visited Jace's parents. It was the least I could do to honor him, to remind them their son wasn't forgotten. They always welcomed me, their gratitude almost painful to witness. It became a ritual I couldn't break, though each visit reopened wounds I tried to suppress. One day, while I was sitting at the student center, drowning in textbooks, I heard a voice. "May I sit here?" I looked up to see her, a tall woman with fiery red hair and a pale, striking face. Her hazel eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I couldn't look away. My gaze slipped to her bright scarlet lips, and I wondered what it might be like to touch them with mine. "Is it okay if I sit here?" she repeated, her voice soft but insistent. "Go ahead," I muttered, trying not to sound too awkward. She placed her books on the table and sat across from me, diving into her studies. I pretended to read, but I couldn't help stealing glances at her. Something about her presence was magnetic. Eventually, she caught me looking and smiled. "You're a veteran, aren't you?" she asked, her voice curious but kind. I tensed, the old defensiveness rising in me. "Yes," I replied simply. "From the Vietnam War?" she clarified. I nodded, hesitant to say more. "My father was a veteran too, but from the Korean War. He was a Marine," she said, her tone casual, like this was just another fact about her life. Hearing that lifted a weight from my chest. For once, I didn't feel so alien. "He was even wounded," she added, almost as an afterthought. She didn't shy away or pity me, and that made all the difference. We talked until she had to leave for class. It wasn't much, but it was the first real conversation I'd had with a woman since coming home. A few days later, I heard her voice again. "E, do you mind if I sit here?" This time, I answered without hesitation. We talked as if we'd known each other for years. Somewhere in the middle of our conversation, she stopped, blushing slightly. "I just realized, I don't know your name." "Phil." "Phil Robinson," I said, extending my hand. She laughed. "Sally Baxter." "Nice to meet you, Phil." From that moment on, we started meeting regularly, falling into a comfortable rhythm during our breaks between classes. Sally told me about her family, her friends, her dreams of a career and a future. She was so sociable, so full of life, and her laughter reminded me of Jace in a strange way. There was something about her, an effortless warmth that drew me in, and she was beautiful. I tried to open up too, telling her about my family and plans, though I avoided the darker stories from Vietnam. Something changed in me because of her. I started shaving again, wearing cleaner clothes, and making an effort to look presentable. My mom noticed the change and couldn't stop smiling, though she didn't say much. A few weeks after meeting Sally, I finally worked up the courage to ask her out. To my relief, she said yes. "I should warn you," she teased. "My father can be very strict with the guys who take me out. Are you sure you're up for that? For the chance to go out with you?" "I'll endure your father, whether it's for a few minutes or a lifetime," I replied, grinning. She blushed. Flatterer. That Friday, I knocked on her door, feeling more nervous than I had in years. Her mother opened it, her smile wide and welcoming. "You must be Phil. We've been expecting you." "Come on in," she said, taking my hand and pulling me inside. "Don't worry about my husband. He's not as scary as he seems." Just then, her father appeared, a tall, broad man with an air of authority. "I'm Jack," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "Come into the living room while Sally finishes getting ready." I followed him into a cozy room with a fireplace adorned with military relics, including an M1 Garand rifle. Jack started asking about my service, and I told him I'd been in artillery, serving in the 1st Corps area of Vietnam. He seemed skeptical at first, but nodded in approval when I explained more about my work. "The 155s were solid artillery," he said. "Marine country, though. By the time I got there, most of the Marines had already pulled out, I replied. He snorted. Vietnamization? Huh? Great term for it's your problem now. Before the conversation could get heated, Sally entered, ending the debate. She looked stunning, and my nerves melted away. We left for dinner and a movie, and I barely remember what we saw. I was too focused on her. At the theater, we held hands, and it felt so natural, so right. Later, when I walked her to her door, I hesitated, unsure if I should kiss her goodbye. But Sally made the first move, wrapping her arms around me and whispering, "Thank you for a lovely evening." I kissed her then, a soft, tender kiss that felt like the beginning of something new. For the first time since Jace died, I felt alive again. Sally brought me peace, hope, and the promise of a future I thought I'd never have. From that night on, we were inseparable, dreaming of a life together filled with love, family, and all the possibilities that lay ahead. Sally had this way of pulling me out of myself, out of that shell I'd built over years of pain and solitude. For the first time in forever, I was truly happy, and I often caught myself smiling without even realizing it. Even my therapist noticed the change and suggested I no longer needed sessions. I had started to heal, not just survive, and Sally was the reason. Her father, Jack, wasn't so sure about me in the beginning. He was old school, skeptical about Sally and me living together before marriage. But everything changed after the family invited me over for dinner one night. While the women were in the kitchen, Jack and I talked. Eventually, he asked about the scars on my body. I hesitated but decided to tell him the truth, about the injuries I'd sustained during the battle for the ripped fire base in the summer of 1970. Jack, being a Marine, knew all about that brutal fight. From that moment on, something shifted. His guarded demeanor softened, and he began treating me like the son he never had. Sally graduated with honors and landed a job as a buyer's assistant in a retail store. We spent nearly every free moment together at my apartment. Shortly after, I graduated on time and secured a job as a draftsman at General Motors. 2 months later, we got married. It felt like everything was falling into place. We bought a small house with room to grow, and a year later, our son Jason was born. I named him after my best friend, Jace. 2 years later, Emily arrived, and then Chloe the year after that. While Jason's birth was monumental for me, it didn't take long for my daughters to steal my heart completely. Sally decided to go part-time after Jason was born, planning to return to full-time work once the kids were in school. Her reduced hours worked well for us, and the employee discount from her job made things even easier. As my career evolved, I moved from translating drawings into automated production programs to participating in early computer-aided design systems. Life was good, better than good. We had money, 2 cars, and a beautiful home that we expanded as our family grew. Every year, we took vacations together, and twice a year, we sent the kids to their grandparents so Sally and I could enjoy romantic weekends alone. Our marriage felt unshakable, full of love, trust, and tenderness. I used to tell Sally often how lucky I felt, how happy I was to have her and the kids. But now I wasn't so sure. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind. Something was wrong. I could feel it. Sally was acting normal, but I wasn't. My thoughts were racing, and every time I imagined the worst-case scenario, my chest tightened. The thought of losing her, losing my family, terrified me. The next morning, I skipped my workout, sitting instead in my office, staring blankly at the wall. I knew I needed a plan, but the idea of confronting Sally made my stomach churn. Would she even tell me the truth? Could I handle it if she did? I jotted down some ideas on a notepad, but none of them felt right. At work and at home, I was a zombie. My colleagues noticed, and even the kids picked up on it. When Jason asked why I seemed so off, I blamed it on a work project. Sally didn't press me, but I could tell she knew something was bothering me. By Tuesday, I forced myself back into my routine, playing squash with John and Steve before work. For the first time, I found their constant camaraderie unsettling. In the locker room, John laughed at something while Steve smirked knowingly. It felt wrong, like there was an inside joke I wasn't in on. For the first time, I looked at them not as friends, but as something closer to adversaries. We played a few games and chatted, but the unease lingered. By Wednesday, I couldn't shake the feeling. I decided to check up on them. That evening, I called John's wife, pretending to be someone from the squash league. I casually asked if he'd be available for a game that Saturday. Her answer hit me like a punch to the gut. "Oh, John? He's going to a business conference in Detroit this weekend. He'll be back Sunday." I hung up, my chest tightening. I called Steve's house next, using the same excuse. His wife gave me the same answer. Both of them were going to be in Detroit. My mind raced. Was this just a coincidence? Or was it confirmation of my worst fears? I didn't need to know the full extent to feel the anger bubbling inside me. My gut told me something wasn't right, and my inner voice urged me to act. That Friday evening, I visited my parents. They were busy with renovations, getting the house ready before heading to Florida for the winter. As we sat at the kitchen table, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "I think Sally is cheating on me," I blurted out, my voice trembling. It was the first time I'd said it out loud, and hearing the words made my heart ache. My mom's face crumpled, her hand flying to her mouth. "No, Phil, no. Not Sally. She wouldn't do that to you," she whispered, her voice shaky. My dad leaned forward, his expression grim. "Why do you think that?" he asked quietly. I recounted everything. The phone call, the strange behavior, the shopping trips, and John and Steve's supposed conference in Detroit. My mom's tears spilled over as she listened, her silent sobs cutting through me like a knife. My dad sat there, his jaw tight, saying nothing for a long while. Finally he spoke. "You need to find out the truth, Phil. You can't let this eat away at you." His words echoed in my mind as I drove home that night. I knew he was right. I had to know. But the question remained, how far was I willing to go to uncover the truth? And if I found it, could I live with it? I sat across from my dad, his arms wrapped tightly around my mom as she wiped away tears. Their concern was palpable. "How can we help, Phil?" Dad asked, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I need to know for sure," I said, my voice cracking under the weight of my own words. "Can you take the kids tomorrow and keep them until Sunday?" Dad nodded without hesitation. "Of course, Phil. I hope this is just a misunderstanding." I nodded, grateful but hollow inside. Returning home that evening, I found Sally humming cheerfully in the kitchen as she prepared dinner. She greeted me with her usual warmth, wrapping her arms around me and kissing my cheek. "The kids are in the playroom. Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes, she said brightly, as if she were looking forward to the weekend. "Honey," I started hesitantly. "We haven't made love since last weekend. Maybe tonight we can put the kids to bed early." Her embrace faltered slightly, her smile becoming strained. "I'd love to, Phil, but I've started my period," she said, her tone apologetic but firm. "Oh, of course, I understand," I replied, trying to keep my voice neutral. Sally caressed my cheek and whispered, "As soon as it's over, I'll let you know. I promise." "Okay," I said, leaning in her touch, though every part of me screamed that something wasn't right. "Then it'll be a date." She hugged me again and returned to cooking. But I knew better. Her periods were always regular, and her excuse felt flimsy. She was saving herself for someone else. The anger burned hotter, and I knew I had to act. The next morning, we went about our usual Saturday routine. I tinkered in the garage, counting the hours until Sally would leave. When she finally came downstairs, suitcase in hand, she called out to the kids to behave while she was gone. Ellie ran up behind her, clutching at her dress. "Bring me something, Mommy," she shouted. Sally bent down, hugging Ellie tightly. "Of course, darling. Be good for Daddy," she said, kissing her. When she kissed me goodbye, I asked casually, "Where are you staying this time?" "At the Red Roof Inn in Rochester Hills," she replied without hesitation. Then with a wave, she was gone. As soon as she left, I told Jason and Emily to pack their things. They were going to Grandma and Grandpa's. Ellie resisted at first, but I helped her get ready. My parents were waiting when we arrived. As I was leaving, Dad put a hand on my shoulder. "Good luck, Phil. I hope you're wrong." "I hope so too, Dad. Thank you. I'll call you in the morning." Back at home, I made my preparations. First, I stopped by Avis and swapped out my car, not wanting to be recognized. By the time I got back, I was pacing the kitchen when the phone rang. I picked it up, bracing myself. "Phil, Sally's voice asked, casual and carefree. Yeah, it's me. Everything's fine, she said brightly, as if anticipating my concern. We're in room 168. Debbie's waving at me. Gotta go. We're heading to Meadowbrook Village Mall tonight. See you tomorrow. She hung up before I could even respond. Her words rattled around in my head as I sat there, gripping the receiver tightly. Something was off. I called the Red Roof Inn and asked if Sally Robinson had checked in. They confirmed she had. Then, on a hunch, I asked if John Harrison was registered. My stomach dropped when they said yes. The anger I had been suppressing erupted. I knew what I had to do. I opened my father's gun cabinet and stared at his old weapons, the 16-gauge shotgun, the Winchester Model 73, and the grip of an old machine gun. But I knew better. If I went in armed, I might never see my kids again. Instead, I strapped an old K-bar knife to my calf and began gathering what I'd need. At 2 a.m., I set out on the 90-mile drive to Rochester Hills. I parked near room 168 and waited, hidden in the shadows. Around 5 a.m., I saw it, the familiar red pickup. John and Craig emerged, laughing and joking, heading into the room next to Sally's. 45 minutes later, they left for a nearby bar. I followed them, spotting Sally's car outside. At 9 a.m., they all emerged from the bar, laughing and holding hands like teenagers. My blood boiled as I watched John flip a coin. Craig leaned in and kissed Sally before heading back to the hotel. Debbie pulled John into another room, the couple splitting off. This wasn't the first time. That much was obvious. 10 years of marriage, my family, my trust, all of it shattered in that moment. An inner voice screamed at me, do something, act. I waited until the right moment. When John came out of Debbie's room, holding a beer, he knocked on Sally's door. Craig emerged, and the two laughed, high-fived, and swapped rooms. It was all I needed to see. I put on my driving gloves, got out of the car, and walked to room 168. Knocking twice, I waited. John opened the door, and without thinking, I hit him hard. He stumbled back, clutching his face. I stepped inside, pulling the knife from my calf, and pointing it at him. How long, John? How long has this been going on? 2 years, he stammered, his voice shaking. So the squash league wasn't just a coincidence, was it? I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. No, he muttered, wincing in pain. You're a sick idiot, John. I growled. If you ever go near Sally or another married woman again, I'll find you. Do you understand? Yes, he whispered, his eyes wide with terror. You'd better leave town, I added, and his face turned pale. He lost control of his stomach, collapsing onto the floor. From the bathroom, Sally's voice called out. John, I thought you'd join me. What's going on? She stepped out, saw me, and froze. Her towel dropped as she stood there in shock. Enjoying yourself, Sally? I spat. She slammed the bathroom door shut with a shriek. I yanked the phone cord from the wall and tossed the receiver into the bathroom, making her scream. I left without another word. By the time I got back home, my anger had settled into cold resignation. My phone rang again. It was Jack. Phil, what the hell happened? Sally's here crying her eyes out, saying you attacked her friends, he shouted. They're lucky I didn't destroy them, I replied coldly. This isn't like you, Phil, Jack said after a long silence. We're coming over. We need to talk. When they arrived, Sally was trembling, her eyes swollen and red. She refused to meet my gaze. Jack sat across from me, eyeing the knife on the table next to my beer. All right, Phil, what's going on? I leaned back, staring directly at Sally. Go on, Sally. Tell your dad what's going on. Shut up, Phil, she snapped, her voice cracking. You and I can sort this out privately. I laughed bitterly. Privately? Why? So no one else knows what you've been up to with your boss and her friends? Jack turned to Sally, his expression a mix of disbelief and anger. Sally, is this true? She hesitated, her face crumpling as she whispered, Dad, And in that moment, everything we had was gone. Jack sat down heavily in a chair, his hands covering his face. He let out a groan. God, he whispered. Sally paled and began to cry. Please, Dad, don't tell Mom. We can work this out. Phil, really? Please. I sat silently at the kitchen table, sifting through old photos and artifacts that I had laid out. Fragments of a life once filled with trust and hope. Each photo, each memory, brought a fresh sting of pain. I flipped through the images, stopping at one of me and Jace, smiling in the jungle, as if Vietnam had been some grand adventure. As if we weren't fighting for our lives every day. I tossed the photo on the table between Jack and Sally, then leaned back. I've never told you about Vietnam, Jack. Not about ripcord, not even to a therapist. I gestured at the items scattered across the table. It's ironic, isn't it? Your generation displays military memorabilia on mantles like trophies. Mina? We bury it in a shoebox at the bottom of a drawer. My voice faltered, but I pressed on. Why is that? No need to answer. Rhetorical question. Jack watched me closely, his face lined with concern. I picked up the faded photo again, staring at it as if it might give me answers. Was I ever that young? I muttered before tossing it back down. I took a deep breath and began. Jason and I were dropped into Ripcord in May 1971. It was supposed to be just another base for our unit, but we were immediately thrown into chaos. Fierce battles surrounded us. Thousands of North Vietnamese soldiers shelled us relentlessly, mortar after mortar, rocket after rocket. The smoke, the chaos, it never stopped. I glanced at Sally, who was frozen in place, staring at the table. Jason, my best friend, was killed in my arms. My voice cracked, but I kept going. Shot by a defector we had trusted. An ally. I managed to fire back, hitting a few soldiers trying to breach the wire, but I was bleeding out, barely hanging on. They finally evacuated me. But Ripcord? It became a symbol of betrayal and senseless loss. Jack's face was pale now, his eyes glassy. He had heard stories of Ripcord, but hearing it from me seemed to bring it all into focus. When I came home, I was a wreck. I couldn't reintegrate into normal life. I was angry, lost, broken. And then I met Sally. My voice softened, the anger briefly giving way to sorrow. Her love brought me back. She healed me, gave me a reason to believe again. Our family became everything to me. I paused, struggling to hold back the tears threatening to break through. And now, it's all gone. Just like that. The room fell into silence, thick and suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, Jack cleared his throat. And what now, Phil? He asked quietly, glancing at Sally. I met his eyes, my voice hollow. I've been betrayed a second time, Jack. And again, I've lost my best friend. Yesterday, I learned Sally has been unfaithful. Not just once, not just with one man, but with several. For 2 years. Sally burst into sobs, her shoulders shaking as she pleaded. Phil, I'm so sorry. It was a mistake, just a mistake. Please forgive me. I shook my head, unable to look at her. Forgive you, Sally? For what? Betraying your vows? Destroying my faith in us? Maybe someday I'll forgive you. But I'll never forget. Every time I see you, this pain will come rushing back. I can't live like that. Jack stood slowly, his movements stiff with emotion. He cast one last look at his daughter before turning to me. You didn't deserve this, Phil, he said quietly. Do what you must. But please, don't seek revenge. I nodded solemnly, handing him my old combat knife. Jack took it, sighed heavily, and left. Sally reached out to stop him, but he pulled away. The silence between us stretched until the shrill ring of the phone shattered it. Sally picked up the receiver, her hands trembling. She listened for a moment before collapsing back into her chair, her face even paler than before. That was Debbie, she whispered, her voice barely audible. She's been fired. She said it's my fault. I crossed my arms, my face hard. Of course it was Debbie. Her so-called friendship with Sally had been nothing but toxic. She was the one who dragged Sally into this mess. Almost smugly, I said, Debbie's husband found out too. He kicked her out and is filing for divorce. Sally's sobs renewed, but I was beyond the point of caring. She begged me not to leave her, promising that it had only been 3 or 4 nights a year, and that she never had feelings for the man. 3 or 4 nights, I repeated bitterly. Just 3 or 4 nights when you gave away what should have belonged only to me. Was it worth it, Sally? Losing your family's respect, your job, our family. I couldn't bring myself to look at her anymore. My eyes swept the room. The family photos on the walls, the children's drawings on the fridge, Ellie's high chair still in the corner. All of it felt like a cruel joke now. Through a veil of tears, I whispered, "I'm sorry, but I can't do this. I won't be able to forget." Sally rocked back and forth in her chair, clutching herself, her sobs quieter now, but no less desperate. I stood, heading toward the door. As I reached it, I stopped and spoke without turning around. "Sally," I said, my voice flat, "you've lost your husband's love, your parents' respect, your job. And now, you'll have to explain to our children why you destroyed this family." I paused, waiting for her to respond. She didn't. "Was it worth it?" I asked one last time. When the silence stretched on, I opened the door and walked out. Behind me, I heard Sally's muffled cries as I stepped into the cold air. And for the first time in years, I felt utterly alone.